Hi everyone, this is C.A.R.E.S here with the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. We're going to give this just a minute or so to let everyone log on. We've got about 600 people joining us today, so as I can see, we're rapidly letting people in. We're at a little over 200 right now, so we will get started in just a moment. Again, hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name is C.A.R.E.S with the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today's webinar title is Accessing Pennsylvania's Share of Federal Stimulus Funds for Affordable Housing, Homeless Assistance, and Community Development. To let you know, this presentation is being recorded and will run approximately 90 minutes, including a question and answer time. We will also send you a link to this recording in the next few days via email, as well as upload it to our YouTube channel and post on our website. Attendees, you are muted during this presentation. If you have questions for the presenters, please type them in the Q&A box in the corner of your screen. If you have a logistical question for myself or other Housing Alliance staff, please use the chat feature. The chat feature should not be used for questions for the presenters. I'll now turn it over to Phyllis Chamberlain, Executive Director for the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania, to begin today's presentation.
Thanks, Stacy. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. Thank you for joining, and especially thanks to the people who've agreed to give us the most up-to-date information on the funding available for affordable housing, homelessness, and community development programs to help low-income households and the organizations that serve them weather the short and long-term impacts of COVID-19. I want to start first by saying that I hope everyone is as safe and well as you reasonably can be. There are a lot of us that can work from the safety of our homes, but there are a lot of you in our network who are still having to go to work because you serve people experiencing homelessness and low-income households. And you might also have loved ones that are either in the same field as we are or are other types of essential workers like healthcare workers. These times are really uncertain and they're a bit scary. And if you or your loved ones are having to still go out to work and are potentially putting yourselves at risk, that's particularly scary. Therefore, I just wanted to start by saying that I hope everyone is as reasonably safe and well as you possibly can be in this time. What we're going to talk about today is information regarding the programs for affordable housing, homelessness, and community development that were made available through the C.A.R.E.S Act, which is the legislation that is sometimes referred to as the third federal stimulus legislation to respond to COVID-19 that was passed by Congress and signed into law on March 27th. I want to start with just a few disclaimers, which is that we at the Housing Alliance and everybody who agreed to speak today for this webinar are working to make sure that we have all the information available, but there could be something that is being released right now. There could be something that was released this morning or yesterday that we might have missed. If that's the case, we'll do our best to correct that information. And of course, we at the Housing Alliance are also continuing to provide you with the most up-to-date information that we are also getting from the folks representing national organizations who are on this call. And I want to thank the national groups in particular for all the information that you're synthesizing and that you're sending to us, and we in turn are sending it to our network. What we're not going to do today is provide information for people who are in need of direct assistance. We're also not going to be talking about unemployment compensation or the direct relief payments that are being sent to some who are eligible through the IRS. If you need that type of information, I'd encourage you to do a few things. If you want information on unemployment insurance, I would suggest going to the website for the Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry. If you want information on the direct relief payments, I'd suggest you go directly to the C.A.R.E.S website. And if you are in need of rental assistance or any other type of housing assistance or service, I'd suggest you contact 211, your local housing authority, or any of the units of local government that administer assistance programs. If you need help figuring out who to call, you can certainly contact us at the Housing Alliance, and we will do our best to help direct you to the right place. I also just want to say that certainly the best information should be available through the websites of the federal agencies that are administering these different programs. Nothing that any of us say on this call today should be construed as legal advice. With that, I am going to share my screen. Okay, just wanted to quickly give you some updates on what we here at the Housing Alliance are doing or are planning to do to help support low-income households and the organizations that serve them. We have a resource page. You can find the link right on this PowerPoint slide. We'll also be sending the PowerPoint slides out after the webinar. You can access the link that way. As I already said, we are continuing to update our resource page with the best information available at this time. The second item is to take action. We at the Housing Alliance are working with national organizations to make sure that a fourth economic recovery package, which we'll talk about on this webinar today, includes additional resources for low-income households and the organizations that serve them. There is an immediate action that we're asking people to take today or at the latest tomorrow morning. Our Congressman Dwight Evans is leading 2 letters, one to congressional leadership and the other to the Treasury Department. And he is asking his colleagues in the Pennsylvania congressional delegation to join him on those letters. The first letter to leadership is to ask for legislative changes to strengthen the low-income housing tax credit program. The second letter is to the Treasury Department asking for extensions of several deadlines also related to the low-income housing tax credit program. We know that LIHTC is our major vehicle for new construction of affordable housing as well as preservation, and we need to make sure that these changes are put into place in order to strengthen the program and make sure that we have what we need to use that program as effectively as possible. We also are going to be sending out information asking people to take action regarding the fourth economic stimulus package, so watch for that. And then of course, as a state organization, we're focused on state advocacy. We are going to be developing policy proposals. We'll be seeking your input into those, and we'll be asking you to take action. We know that low-income households are at higher risk for contracting and dying from the disease. We also know that low-income households work in occupations that have been and might continue to be heavily impacted by the stay-at-home orders and the basic shutdown of different aspects of our economy. And we want to make sure that tenants can still pay their rent, which brings me to the next piece, that we also want to make sure that landlords are able to meet their own financial and operational obligations. We issued a survey very recently asking landlords what is the impact on them of COVID-19. And we're kicking off a landlord peer learning exchange. The first kickoff webinar will be held next week at 1 p.m. Our newsletter will be going out later today, and you will find details on how to register for that webinar. Our purpose here is really to share strategies so that we can prevent evictions for low-income households, but also that we can make sure that landlords are able to meet their own obligations. So I hope that if you are a landlord, that you plan to join us, and definitely tell us what you're doing in order to work with tenants that we can be promoting to others. All right, here are the programs that we're going to talk about today on this webinar. We're not going to be talking about these programs in this order necessarily. In addition to the programs that are listed under the third bullet for the C.A.R.E. Act, we're going to touch on the federal moratorium on evictions. There is, of course, a moratorium on evictions here in Pennsylvania that is in effect until April 30th, but there is an additional moratorium at the federal level for some types of housing that extends further than April 30th, which is, again, the date when our moratorium currently ends. It could obviously be extended. We're also going to talk a bit about the timing of the distribution of some of these funds, and we're going to touch on the resources that are available through FEMA. And I want to mention that the National Low Income Housing Coalition has a really great toolkit that gives you information on what is reimbursable from FEMA in terms of some of the costs that your organization may be incurring. This link provides you with the list of allocations, at least the initial list of allocations by jurisdiction for CDBG, ESG, and HOPWA. Not all of the funds that were allocated at the federal level have been allocated yet, and that's why it is an initial list. And then we also are providing you with the list of CDBG contacts in Pennsylvania in case you do not have that information. Stacy, I am going to stop sharing my screen and you can put back up the slide with the speakers. All right. So again, I want to thank each of the individuals that has agreed to join us today on our webinar. There, as Stacy said, there are over 600 people who registered for this webinar. So even though there is a lot of information that has become available, having so many people be interested in joining us today really speaks to the fact that there's too much information available. It's probably not completely accessible. It might not be super easy to digest. And that's why we wanted to host this webinar today, to give you the best information available. And I'm really grateful that each of the individuals who agreed to speak today are here with us. We have a few folks from national organizations, Ed Gramlich with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Mike Wallace from the National League of Cities, and Jerry Jones from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. We're also going to hear from Jack Croakey, who's with our U.S. Senator Bob Casey's office. And then we'll also hear from Kathy Possinger, who's with the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development. And we're going to start with Ed, and Ed, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. Just a little update. Phyllis was talking about, what's the latest. As of noon, there was nothing significant on any of the key websites that I monitored on a daily or sometimes twice daily basis. But what I've been asked to talk about is not about the new stuff, but sort of like the quote-unquote old stuff that comes out of the C.A.R.E.S Act from way back in March of 27. I want to give you a little bit of a warning. They've asked me to talk about 5 different aspects or programmatic parts of the C.A.R.E.S Act, and my presentation might be a little bit longer than the others, so please be patient. So first thing I'm going to talk about is that federal renter eviction moratorium that's built into the C.A.R.E.S Act. The C.A.R.E.S Act created this federal moratorium, or a ban, if you will, on evictions of tenants who are living in certain kinds of housing. This federal eviction moratorium took effect on March 27 when it was signed into law, and it extends for 120 days, which takes it to July 25. It's important for you all to know, though, that people will still owe all of the missed rent, and we all are concerned about the cliff that many people might fall off of once the moratorium expires. And there's a possibility that that the federal moratorium could also be extended. So the C.A.R.E.S Act says that landlords cannot file a new eviction action for non-payment of rent. It also says that landlords cannot charge late fees, penalties, or other charges to a tenant that's related to their non-payment of rent. The federal moratorium also prohibits a landlord from evicting a tenant after the moratorium expires until after the landlord gives a tenant a 30-day notice of the landlord's intent for the eviction. This notice cannot be given until the end of the moratorium period. So in effect, there's like 150 days for the tenant. Now, there are a whole bunch of federal programs that are listed in the Act, and I'm going to quickly name all of those. So bear with me. It includes public housing, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the multifamily project-based rental assistance programs, 202 housing for the elderly, Section 811 housing for people with disabilities, Section 236 multifamily rental housing, Section 221D3 BMIRs, the home program, the Hopwood program, the McKinney-Vento homeless assistance programs. Then there are a number of rural programs as well, Section 515 rural rental housing, Sections 514 and 516 farm labor housing, Section 533 housing preservation grants, Section 538 multifamily guaranteed rural rental housing, and Section 542 rental housing vouchers. And last but certainly not least is the low-income housing tax credit. People can check whether or not the property they're in is covered under most of these programs by going to the NLIC's website. We have a preservation database. You can find it at preservationdatabase.org. Also covered are properties with a federally backed mortgage. This means that a landlord's mortgage is backed by FHA, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, the Veterans Administration, or USDA. Now, a tenant needs to ask the landlord if their property is covered, if they're not already covered by those other federal programs that I talked about. And if the landlord doesn't know, they can find out by going to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. And so that's the quick summary of the mortgage, the eviction moratorium in the C.A.R.E.S Act. I've been asked to talk about some of the more important dollar programs, and the first one I'm going to be talking about is the $5 billion for CDBG appropriation. I'm guessing that's what most people here are interested in. So out of that $5 billion, $2 billion worth of allocations were announced on April 1st, as Phyllis mentioned. This is to be distributed according to the statute to states and entitlement jurisdictions using the same formula used to distribute the regular annual FY20 CDBG allocations. And the statute said the money has to go out within 30 days of enactment, which of course it did by at least getting the announcement out on April 1st. Now, I would want to note that there's nothing in the Act that suggests to me that this extra $2 billion must be used to address coronavirus-related needs. Therefore, advocates will have to work really hard to to get as much as possible of this new extra resource used to address coronavirus-related housing and homeless needs. And I think Mike is going to be talking about that a little bit later. Now, I just talked about $2 billion. The CARES Act also requires an additional $1 billion to be allocated to states and insular areas to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus within the state or insular area. And that includes activities within entitlement jurisdictions as well as in non-entitlement communities. This money is to be distributed using a formula based on public health needs, the risk of transmission of coronavirus, the number of coronavirus cases compared to the national average, and economic and housing market disruptions, as well as other factors. And this formula is going to be determined by HUD. We still haven't seen what that formula is just yet. HUD has 45 days to allocate this extra $1 billion. So that leaves us with another $2 billion out of the 5, and this is to be distributed directly to a state or local unit of government at the discretion of HUD, according to a formula based on factors to be determined by HUD, but giving priority to the risk of coronavirus, the number of coronavirus cases compared to the national average, and economic and housing market disruptions resulting from the pandemic. These allocations can be made on a rolling basis. They don't have to come out all at once. There are some other key provisions pertaining to the CDBG program. One is that these allocations that I just talked about can be used to cover or reimburse costs consistent with the Act, regardless of the date the costs were incurred. And this also applies to the FY19 and FY20 allocations. And here's an important one to me especially, and I think to you all. The 15% public service cap is eliminated, not only for the CARES Act allocations, but also for the FY19 and FY20 allocations. And then starting to conclude the discussion about the CDBG program, there are also provisions in the Act regarding con plans and annual action plans. It says that grantees can adapt and use expedited procedures to prepare, propose, modify, or amend action plans for the amounts that are made available by the CARES Act, as well as CDBG funds already made available in FY19 and 20. The statute also says that grantees do not need to hold in-person public hearings, but must provide the public with at least 5 days of notice and a reasonable opportunity to comment. Grantees can have virtual public hearings as long as the public is given a reasonable notice of this virtual thing, presentation and access to it. Grantees must still provide timely responses to any questions or issues raised by the public, as well as give the public access to all of the response. So that's the CDBG program. I know Mike is going to be talking a lot more about that in a few minutes. The next program I've been asked to talk about is HOPWA, the Housing for People with AIDS. The Act provides up to $65 million in HOPWA supplemental funding. Of that $65 million, at least $50 million is supposed to be allocated using the formula that was used to allocate the FY20 HOPWA funds. On April 1st, HUD announced the allocation of $53.7 million of the supplemental HOPWA money. The CARES Act also requires that up to $10 million is to be provided as a one-time, non-renewable award to grantees that are currently administering existing contracts for permanent supportive housing. And the April 1st CPD notice announcement listed the amounts that each of those current programs will be getting. So that amounted to $10 million. Some other provisions pertaining to HOPWA. The awards do not have to be used for permanent housing. Housing payment assistance for rent, mortgage, and utility payments can be provided for up to 24 months. Funds can be used to self-isolate, quarantine, or to provide other coronavirus infection control services as recommended by the CDC. And then finally, funds may be used to provide relocation services, including to provide lodging at hotels, motels, or other locations for people living with HIV/AIDS and for household members who are not living with HIV/AIDS. The second to last program I'm going to be talking about, the Housing Voucher Program. The CARES Act provided $1.25 billion for the voucher program. The purpose is to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus, including to provide additional funds for public housing agencies so that they can maintain their normal operations and to take on other necessary actions during the pandemic. Out of that $1.25 billion, $850 million is for both administrative expenses and other expenses that PHAs might incur with their program due to coronavirus. These other expenses will be new eligible activities that HUD is determining and we'll talk about, will be defined in an upcoming notice. These other expenses will be include activities to support or to maintain health and safety of voucher holders, as well as to help the costs related to keeping and supporting landlords in this time. Finally, not quite so finally, but anyway, the PHA's FY20 regular allocation can also be used for these new eligible activities. So out of that $1.25 billion, $400 million is for adjustments in the calendar year 2020 Housing Choice Voucher renewal funding for PHAs that might experience a significant increase in their voucher per unit costs due to extraordinary circumstances, such as decreasing tenant rent payments as their work hours are reduced or as they lose employment. Or that $400,000 can also be used for PHAs that would otherwise have to terminate voucher households as a result of insufficient funding. HUD will be issuing separate notices about that $850 million and that $400 million. Also, on a phone call to PHAs, PIH said it wants to get money out by May 1st, and that amount of money should cover 2 months of admin fees. And finally, I'm going to be talking about the Public Housing Operating Fund provisions in the CARES Act. $685 million was appropriated for the operating fund. The purpose of the money is to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the virus, including to provide additional funds to PHAs to help them maintain normal operations and to take any other necessary actions during the pandemic. This extra operating fund is to be combined with the PHA's FY20 operating fund allocation, and it will be distributed using the regular operating fund formula. The Act also allows PHAs to combine its capital funds with its operating funds up until December 31st in order to cover other expenses related to preventing, preparing for, and responding to the virus, including activities to support and maintain the health and safety of residents. It also allows new eligible activities to support education and child care for residents. HUD will be issuing notices about the new eligible activities related to education and child care activities. It will have a separate notice about how PHAs can mix their capital and operating funds. We'll have another notice about evictions if that becomes necessary. And finally, another notice about the community service requirement. HUD has issued several FAQs that will probably continue to do that. They will be on the PIH website. And last Friday, HUD issued a huge set of broad regulatory waivers. I summarized those in this Monday's note of members. And then finally, on another phone call with PHAs, PIH said it intends to get this money out by May 1st, and that should cover about 2 months of Public Housing Authority's operating funds. And with that, that is my presentation for now. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ed. We're going to now hear from Mike Wallace with the National League of Cities.
Great, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk on this very important call today. Just want to mention that National League of Cities is part of the same coalition that the Pennsylvania Municipal League is part of, and I know that they're a member of your alliance, and so we really appreciate everything you're doing for your cities, towns, villages. Also, very pleased to see Senator Casey represented on the call. He has just been a stalwart champion for local governments and cities, large and small, and has been a huge champion of ours in this situation we're responding and keeping people safe in the COVID virus. Ed gave a very good overview of the technical piece. At the National League of Cities, we work primarily with elected officials, mayors, council members, and we worked very hard along with you as advocates to secure this funding. The CARES Act really, for local governments, the CARES Act provides funding to help residents and households on the economic margins. That's what it's about. So it's CDBG, it's ESG, the other forms of assistance that are coming through really is meant to prevent economic decline in this situation where we really have paused all economic activity, and it's jeopardized a lot of our residents. So we got our local officials to fight hard for this funding. That doesn't mean they know the best way to use it right out of the gate. This is an extraordinary time. Things are changing. I can tell you elected officials are in crisis management mode, managing a crisis like none ever before. They're putting out fires. They're not particularly thinking systematically about the best way to use this funding. And we want to help them do that. You all on this call have a very important role in helping them do that, to make sure, as you learned today, how you can use this CARES Act funding for housing people, for housing stability, for reducing homelessness, that you help us break through the clutter and get that message heard loud and clear by elected officials everywhere. One thing that we've done to help, that you'll have access to sometime after the call, is NLC, in cooperation with the National Alliance to End Homelessness and the National Low Income Housing Coalition, have drafted a guidance for local officials on how to use CARES Act funding for housing stability and addressing homelessness in response to the COVID epidemic. And I'll run through just briefly what those steps are, specifically as it relates to the Community Development Block Grant Program. We fought very hard for CDBG funds because we recognized that, we looked at the last Recovery Act following a Great Recession and saw most of the housing resources sort of lived within Treasury, lived at the federal level, and were very hard to access, and in retrospect, did not serve as many residents or households as they should have. So we fought for CDBG basically just to get funding into the hands of the same local officials who were declaring eviction moratoriums, so that they could both work with the residents to keep them stably housed if they lost their revenue or something like that, but also be able to work directly with the landlords and property owners to keep them whole, to make good faith payments, to make sure that they had some kind of cash flow that wasn't going to be come from residents who no longer had a salary. So that, as Ed said, we are very concerned that an eviction moratorium would lead to an eviction cliff without some sort of assistance going to landlords and property owners, particularly those who are renting to low-income households and who are participating in federal programs to that end. So CDBG can be useful for that purpose. The HUD has said that CDBG grants can be used to make payments to landlords on behalf of tenants for 3 months. So it's a temporary situation right now. They can get 3 months of rental assistance that way. We are going to ask HUD for an extension beyond that 3 months as we continue to ask for additional funds for CDBG for these purposes. When Ed says the 15% cap is lifted, what that means is cities can use 100% of their CARES Act CDBG funds for rental assistance, and certainly I expect that the need is there much even beyond what those grants are going to be. But it's not only rental assistance. Cities can use CDBG for mortgage assistance as well, for utility payments and assistance, for emergency home maintenance and rehabilitation, emergency public housing maintenance, meal and medicine delivery, and can use it also for acquisition of hotels and motels to expand capacity for hospitals or homeless shelters trying to maintain social distancing requirements throughout this epidemic. So you can do a lot with it. You can also use it for economic development purposes, for everything you could normally use CDBG for. But we have drafted a guidance strongly urging local governments to use this funding for housing stability and homelessness, just because we can see down the road that once the eviction moratoriums end, we could be in a much worse place than where we started from. If people, by the hundreds are suddenly found homeless, if we and that would be bad enough that it would cancel out any economic stimulus that Congress might have coming for us later. In terms of the technical pieces, I strongly urge you to consult HUD or groups like the National Income Housing Coalition, who can guide you there. But we are going to work hard to get our guidance into the hands of the local officials. I guess the last thing I will add too is that there is a coronavirus relief fund. I think it's 150 billion that's going to go directly to states and cities over 500,000. Many of the states will be sharing a portion of their fund down to cities and towns and counties below 500,000, although it's not a guarantee, so you'll have to see how it works in your state. But we have asked Treasury to make it clear that coronavirus relief funds can also be used to make rent payments on behalf of renters who have lost their salaries and who are at risk of eviction as a result of the economic pause caused by COVID-19. We think the law is clear that it already gives state and local governments that authority, but we know that state and local governments will use that authority much more quickly and robustly if they have explicit acknowledgement from Treasury. So we're working hard to get that as well. And with that, I'll turn it over, but stay on the line and try to answer some of the questions that pop up.
Great, thanks, Mike. Next, we're going to hear from Jerry Jones with the National Alliance to End Homelessness.
Hi, thank you for having me join the call. I'm going to talk about the homelessness portions of the C.A.R.E.S Act. Most of that is $4 billion for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. It's important, I think, first to point out that this is not the main program that most homeless service providers get from Washington, which is the continuum of care grants. ESG, as it's called, Emergency Solutions Grants, is a smaller portion of that. It used to be the cornerstone of the federal funding for homelessness back when the Stewart v. McKinney Act was initially passed and shelters were the main focus. And it was called the Emergency Shelter Grant Program, but it was renamed and redesigned in 2009 as part of the C.A.R.E.S Act, and it's broader now. But it's important to recognize that in a typical year, ESG is usually like 1/10 of the amount of money that local communities are getting from Washington to address homelessness. And so most of the activity is around the COC competition, around the HUD NOFA for the Continuum of Care grant. And unless you're a shelter operator or you have a particularly good relationship with your mayor or county, you may not be as familiar with ESG even if you're in the homeless sector. So I point that out. I wouldn't be surprised if some folks on the call are quickly boning up on exactly what ESG does, because it works differently from 9/10 of the federal homeless money. It flows to local governments. So if you're in an urban county or a metro city, that's where most of the funding for ESG is just by formula granted. And then there's the balance of that is the balance of state grant that states get from ESG. In the normal program, you can spend it on a range of things, almost all of which are short term. So there's shelter is the main focus for ESG historically. There's street outreach. You can do short to medium term rental assistance and rapid rehousing with those dollars. And you can do homelessness prevention. That's how the program usually works. The C.A.R.E.S Act really flexed up the program. And so the dollars are intended for people who are either homeless or at risk of homelessness. And under the C.A.R.E.S Act, being at risk of homelessness is simply if you're at or below 50% of the area median income. You qualify to benefit from this ESG funding, this $4 billion. So it's a lot more money than ESG has typically vehicle for it in a typical year. I think it's about $280 million. This is $4 billion. The C.A.R.E.S Act eliminates a lot of the requirements that had been in place to then provide maximum flexibility to local and state officials. So the usual decision-making process and planning requirements have been minimized. There's no cap on the, usually there's about a 60% cap on what you can use ESG for shelter and street outreach. That's been eliminated. If you're opening temporary shelter, the environmental and habitability reviews have been waived. There's no match. Usually there's a match. There were, for the regular program, procurement requirements that were in place. Those have been eliminated. And the admin, the amount of money you can spend on admin has been boosted to 10%. It's usually, I think, 7.5%. One thing that Congress did include in C.A.R.E.S Act that's important is to make clear that there is not, the local use of the money can't require people to engage in treatment or other kinds of prerequisites in exchange for receiving services. But otherwise, the funding is intended to be quite flexible for homelessness use. And in addition to all of those statutory efforts to increase flexibility, the C.A.R.E.S Act also says that the HUD Secretary has the authority to waive any other requirements under ESG that would expedite its use during the pandemic. And so on April 1st, HUD published a number of waivers, not just related to ESG, but other programs as well. And under ESG, as well as the Continuum of Care program, and I think HOPWA, the fair market rent standards were waived. I think some of the other, the reevaluations for whether you qualify for homelessness prevention under ESG was waived. There were certain requirements related to casework management for housing stability. Those were waived for ESG. So in summary, this is a $4 billion pot of money that is to benefit people who are homeless or people on the brink of homelessness at 50% of EMI or less. That states, counties, cities, balance of state communities can use with a tremendous amount of flexibility. Shortly before the C.A.R.E.S Act, HUD issued guidelines for the kinds of things you want to be able to use your ESG dollars for, and it ranged from everything related to hand sanitizers and wash stations and so forth for street outreach, to using this funding to reconfigure your shelter to create more distancing. Many cities are using this funding to create new space for people to come inside in entirely new facilities as well. I mentioned a little bit about the timeline for how this money is going to roll out. And so it's $4 billion. HUD had the option of spending up to half of it right away under the current ESG formula. They have chosen to spend $1 billion under the existing formula. The other $3 billion will then flow under a new formula that they're developing that reflects the more coronavirus-related needs of local communities. For the $1 billion that's already been announced, we know that Pennsylvania is getting $56 million. About $36 million of that will go to the urban counties and metro cities that get their own ESG allocation, and then $20 million of that will go to the balance of states. I'll start by saying that there's been some reaction to why was ESG chosen as the vehicle for the homelessness funding, since it was a smaller share of the overall homelessness, federal homelessness funding stream. Part of this, I think, was because the C.A.R.E.S Act prioritized resources to local and state officials. So this was a formula grant directly to those jurisdictions as opposed to the complicated competition that goes on with the continuum of care. Let me also mention that national organizations are encouraging HUD to rethink whether we need a continuum of care competition this year. And the lethality of this pandemic and just the disruption to our daily lives, it would be difficult to imagine the meetings and the process that usually goes into a NOFA competition of the COC program. So the ESG is in keeping with the larger $150 billion relief fund that Mike mentioned to state and local officials. And it's also intended to be an emergency response. So these are short-term to medium-term responses to the needs of folks who are out of doors, people who are in shelter, who are at risk of coronavirus. It's not long-term thinking, and I think need homeless providers and advocates are raising concerns. We also need a longer-term strategy beyond the sheltering and the other sort of street-level interventions that ESG will be funding with this $4 billion, and that's exactly right. That's not the way this funding is structured. And we will be, as I think we'll touch on later in the call, we'll be going back to Congress because we also know $4 billion will not be enough given the number of folks who are going to be falling into homelessness. But that this will carry us through until C.A.R.E.S 2 relief package is developed. So those were the main points I wanted to touch on, and if there's time, I'm sure there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers afterwards. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Ed, I believe that we're going back to you to touch on just a few additional programs. Is that right, or did you cover everything when you spoke earlier?
Earlier, when we planned this call, you asked me to talk about waivers to the HOPWA program, talking about immigration status, and briefly about FEMA. Is that when you'd like me to touch upon those things now?
Please.
Okay. So jumping back to the HOPWA program, Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, there are a number of waivers that were announced by CPD on April 1st. It was in a memorandum, although the memorandum is undated. It outlines the coronavirus-related program waivers for HOPWA, as well as Jerry mentioned, COCs and ESGs. I'm going to talk about HOPWA specifically. A major one is regarding housing quality standards, HQS. For HOPWA, there are several waivers regarding that. The current HOPWA regulations require units occupied by residents recipients of HOPWA tenant-based rental assistance, TBRA, to meet housing quality standards. CPD is waiving the physical inspection requirement for 1 year for HOPWA tenant-based rental assistance, and that 1 year starts on the date that that memorandum was published, which is April 1st, even though it's not dated on the memorandum itself. This can happen as long as a recipient of the HOPWA money, the entity, is able to visually inspect the unit using technology such as video streaming to ensure that the unit meets HQS before providing any assistance to an individual. Also, the recipient or subrecipient of HOPWA has to have written policies to physically re-inspect the unit within 3 months after health officials say it's safe to do so. Jerry also mentioned fair market rents, FMRs. There are waivers to the requirement that rent payments not exceed the FMR for the HOPWA program. The waiver notice says that rent reasonableness standards that are in the HOPWA program still apply, however. And for HOPWA TBRA, that program waiver may be used for up to 1 year from the date of the memorandum. There are two other key waivers. A family may self-certify that they are income eligible and have a credible information regarding their HIV status. HOPWA space and security regulations are waived, so entities operating facilities and shared housing arrangements have the flexibility to use optional appropriate spaces for quarantine services for people affected by COVID-19. Optional spaces could include hotels, motels, in cases where a family member who would otherwise be occupying the same space is therefore not allowing adequate space and security for themselves and their belongings. So that's a quick rundown of the waivers for HOPWA. I know I've been getting a lot of questions about, well, can ESG or CDBG money be used to serve people who do not have the proper immigration status? My colleague, Sonia Acosta, at the Coalition has been working with Jackie Vimo at the National Immigration Law Center, and they put together a table that should be available very shortly. Basically the answer is yes. CDBG money and ESG money can be used to assist people regardless of their immigration status. It's really important for everybody to know that. It's important for people in the immigrant community to understand that. Also, people do not need to worry about the public charge implications. And if people don't know what that is, I can explain it later on. Some of the other HUD programs, however, public housing, Section 8 vouchers, project-based rental systems, those do have immigration restrictions. However, HOPWA, Section 202 and Section 811 do not have these immigration restrictions. I just wanted to highlight that for you all. And then finally, Phil said that the National Housing Coalition has a bunch of FEMA information on it. I used to know this stuff for the first 9 months after Harvey, but thankfully somebody else at the coalition, Noah Patton, has taken that over. In particular, as Phyllis mentioned, there's a toolkit called Working with FEMA to Address COVID-19 Housing and Homelessness Needs. It's a 15-page guide that will acquaint you with the Byzantine workings of the FEMA program. There's also another 3-pager called FEMA Public Assistance and the COVID-19 Crisis. It explains what Category B is, how to access it, and which nonprofits are eligible for this Category B public assistance money. To get those resources, go to the NLIC website, which is nlihc.org. Scroll down a bit, and you'll see the graphic for the COVID-19 webpage. Once there, go to quote-unquote NLIC materials, and those 2 items will be at the very bottom of that list. Also, under national updates, there are various FEMA resources. If you have questions, want more guidance, I urge you to write to Noah Patton. That's NPATTON at nlihc.org. So that's my little coda on this section. Back to you, Phyllis.
Great, thanks, Ed. Next, we're going to turn to Jack Croakey, who is with Senator Casey's office. Jack?
Hi, this is Jack Rourke with Senator Bob Casey's office. Thanks for everybody on the call. I've been asked to talk about 2 things, the State and Local Stabilization Fund and also the upcoming potential future coronavirus response legislation. So I'll start with that and just sort of give you a top level on where we think things are right now. I think before we get onto a COVID 4 bill, we will probably have to do a COVID 3.1 bill, which would be extending a lot of the programs that were created and funded in the last bill. I think as some of you probably have seen, the Small Business Paycheck Protection Program was running low on funds and ran out of funds this morning. So I think that there is a bipartisan interest in increasing funding for that program. In addition to that, the Democrats are pushing for increases to the State and Local Stabilization Fund. Over the weekend, the National Governors Association sent a letter led by Governor Hogan of Maryland and Governor Cuomo of New York, saying that states are going to need $500 billion of funding, and in addition to the $150 billion that was provided in the first bill. In addition to that, I know that Democrats are also pushing for some tweaks to the lenders, we've heard that we are trying to reach as many businesses as possible, not just businesses that have relationships with banks. So I think it is important to increase the availability to offer to participate in the Paycheck Protection Program to community development financial institutions, qualified economic development institutions, and let them also make loans to the businesses that they have pre-existing relationships with. And we are hopeful that will create more parity in the program and reach a wider cross-section of businesses than we believe is being addressed today. So, we are hopeful those negotiations are going on as we speak, between Speaker Pelosi, Senator Schumer, and Secretary Mnuchin. So, I think that there's still some work to be done, but hopefully we can have something that can pass both houses by unanimous consent in the coming days to address that, because those funds, the small business program is out of money, and we really need to recapitalize that. After that, I think that, we will turn our attentions to a COVID-4 bill. I think that there's a number of folks that, are going to have ongoing needs that weren't addressed in prior legislation. I know in terms of housing, the senator was sort of disappointed with the lack of provisions to extend, for eviction protections, mortgage foreclosure preventions for wider subsections of the population, as opposed to just folks that have federally backed mortgages and live in federal housing. So I think that's something that's high on the Democrats' list, and we're going to be taking a look at that as well. And I encourage folks on the call, if you have any additional concerns or requests, to now is the time to make sure that they get to our office, and we would appreciate you taking the time to do that, because we know that there's a lot of unmet needs out there. In relation to the state and local stabilization fund, as I mentioned, there's a broad interest in increasing the funding for that program. The initial bill only provided $150 billion, and there was a lot of restrictions on how that money can be spent. Senator Casey has been pushing to allow that funding to have a more broader use, not just for COVID-19 response efforts, but also for helping communities, states, and local governments supplement their revenue losses. That's something we're hearing from folks across the Commonwealth about that, and I know that's a pressing issue. So that's something we will be pushing on in this round of negotiations and in any future rounds of negotiations. I know that Senator Casey isn't alone in that, and that's a huge priority for Senator Schumer, the Democratic leader, as well. So, that those are, I guess, our top line efforts, but certainly encourage you, if you have any, if anyone on the call has questions, concerns, issues with any of the programs I've talked about, or any programs that I haven't mentioned, our office really wants to be a resource. And, I'm sure the folks from the Housing Alliance can provide my contact information if you don't have it already. We have a website that has a lot of resources, www.casey.senate.gov, that has a lot of resources that explain the different CARES Act programs, how you can apply for things. If you're having issues with direct payments, small businesses, nonprofits, if you're self-employed, there's sort of a whole gambit we have on there. That's some guides on there that are hoping to provide as much information as we can, and that's something we're updating multiple times a week. As we get information, we're trying our best to get it out there. So happy to continue doing that, and let me know if I can be helpful with anything else. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jack. Thanks for being here, and thank you to Senator Casey for his leadership. Next, we're going to hear from Kathy Possinger with the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development. Kathy?
Thanks, Phyllis. Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this dialogue today. I think as a grantee of federal programs, even though we represent the state as a funder of many small communities, hearing from our colleagues at the federal level about the advocacy work that they're doing in order to really synthesize the tremendous amount of information that's coming down out of the CARES Act. As everyone has said, it's a moving target. We're consistently watching for waiver information and additional guidance on the specific programs that we administer. And hearing firsthand from all of you today has really been a help to me, as I'm sure it is for the 400 or so other participants that are on this call. So thank you all for your great leadership and stewardship for these resources and funds and those that we serve. So I'm going to give a little bit of information about Pennsylvania's perspective. So through the Department of Community and Economic Development, Pennsylvania receives allocations of funding through HUD, specifically with the Community Development Block Grant and Emergency Solutions Grant, although our comprehensive plan, consolidated plan, also includes the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS allocation, although that is administered through the Department of Health. So I'll point to the Department of Health for additional information and insight on those specific resources. So I will note that for Pennsylvania, what does all of this mean? Pennsylvania as a whole is slated to receive in the Community Development Block Grant CARES allocation about $112 million. In the Emergency Solutions Grant, that total allocation, that percentage of the overall $1 billion that was allocated is about 56 million, a little bit over 56 million. And for Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, that number is a little bit lower. Pennsylvania administers a small portion for several small communities, and we'll see about 313,000 there. Now, as Mike said, many communities receive those allocations of funding because they came by way of a formula. These first allocations of funding and these first tranches are subject to the fiscal year 2020 allocation formula. So for many communities, that's a significant infusion of resources that's going to be coming quickly, and we're all watching very closely for information about waivers and guidance that's coming forward. For Pennsylvania's non-entitlement communities, and those are the communities that, as we've mentioned before, that balance of the state, those non-direct federal entitlement communities. The resources for those communities come by way of Pennsylvania's DCED. For the Community Development Block Grant CARES allocation, we are going to see about 24,600,000. And then for the Emergency Solutions Grant, about 19,900,000, almost $20 million to be able to assist those smaller communities to address the homeless needs that are emerging as a result of the coronavirus. What I can tell you at this point, so I'm going to back up just a little bit of what are we doing right now. We're doing several things simultaneously at DCED. First off, we've identified that in our ESG allocations, where the 2018-2019 resources that are still being expended by our local communities, as well as 2020 applications that are coming due here in the next week, what we've done is very quickly changed our priorities for how we're expending those funds. Typically, DCED and its allocation of ESG has focused on a rapid rehousing approach. Our principal focus with those resources has always been a housing first approach. So the majority of our funds address that specific rapid rehousing need. Recognizing the strain on our shelter providers, as well as the crisis that is coming with the moratoriums on evictions potentially being lifted here in the next several weeks, we know that there's going to be a significant change in the demand for those resources. So what we've done for those existing funding sources is gone ahead and already established a substantial amendment to our consolidated plan and our individual action plans for those program years to allow all of our funds to go to the statutory and regulatory minimums. So what does that mean? That means we've taken off our caps for emergency shelter provision of services, emergency shelter operations, and as well as the rapid rehousing. Removing the cap the minimum allocation that we institute in those programs. So our existing grantees who are already administering a contract and have funds that are unobligated to specific activities, they're able to make proposals to DCD, make changes to their structure and their individual methods of distribution, and request changes and modifications in their program. This will allow them to identify the need that they're seeing in their shelters and be able to meet those individual needs. It'll also allow them to set resources that were potentially once supporting rapid rehousing that are unobligated to move those resources into a homelessness prevention line, for example. So those are important critical needs that are happening right now. They still do follow the existing citizen participation and consolidated plan amendment requirements. So that means that we are currently in the process, as we speak today, those changes are posted on DCED's website, and we'll have a public hearing next week to review those changes and then submit those to HUD as soon as that comment period is over. Moving forward with the ESG CARES Act allocation, DCED is finalizing its guidelines for how it'll utilize those funds. We are utilizing an expedited application process. We're also taking advantage of some of the expedited consolidated plan and citizen participation requirements that are included in the CARES Act as well. We'll be publishing our use of those funds here shortly. We'll be, as I said, we're in the final stages of finalizing our guidelines. We rely on our local communities to identify the local priorities and to establish programs for the uses of our ESG funds to meet those specific local needs. We fund units of local government who partner with their service providers, and we'll also fund some nonprofit organizations, as many are aware, so long as they're looking at a regional project. And we define regional as more than one county approach to a solution. So it's recognizing that there are some communities and some counties that are working together to address their individual homeless needs or a full continuum of programs and services to meet needs in communities. So in those instances, we are working hand in hand with our partners at PHFA, Department of Human Services, and others to ensure that we're really addressing some of the needs that we're all starting to see in the communities related to emergency solutions. I'll also note, so for the Community Development Block Grant Program, as Mike also noted, several of the CARES Act obligations also provided waivers within the CARES Act for the fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 2020 federal allocations. That's a really important tool, especially for those public service waivers that are available, some of the consolidated plan waivers that are available, allowing for some expedited implementation of some of those changes as well. It's important to know that Pennsylvania's Community Development Block Grant Program is governed through a state statute, Act 179 of 1984, that establishes the method of distribution for Pennsylvania's program. And what it also does is establish a small entitlement program that really mirrors HUD's entitlement structure, where we fund 50 counties, 28 cities, and about 122 boroughs and townships across Pennsylvania. And those communities establish their local priorities to address these needs. And of course, these funds, as we're finalizing some of our expedited guidelines for utilizing the CDBG CARES allocation, will follow that same distribution formula. A portion of those resources, though, will be able to, are always set aside competitively. And this first tranche of funds, because it follows the HCDA fiscal year 2020 allocation, follows that method for distribution as well. So we're working and finalizing our application process and really paying a very, very close attention to as much detail as HUD is providing for CDBG waivers. We know that a series of waivers were released might have been Friday of this week, and I apologize, I don't remember the exact date, but a series of waivers were released for the home program that we're evaluating as well, where makes allowances for home-funded projects, home-funded rental projects, CHOTO projects as well. We're anticipating that HUD is working diligently on a similar set of waivers and additional guidance for the CDBG program as well. We've fielded a number of questions about the use of CDBG, how communities can use those public service resources, how communities can utilize the assistance to businesses to support those businesses that are impacted in their communities. A lot of our providers are looking to really identify ways. So I know many of them will be excited to see Mike's guidance from the National League of Cities and how some of our public officials can utilize those funds as well. So the last thing that I will note is that because of our process, we're moving. Although we're evaluating and establishing our priorities as we're moving, and most of our programs are identified at the local level, we are working through the amendment to our action plan, which is a procedural requirement that HUD has for utilizing these funds. So we'll be amending our 2019 action plan and adding the C.A.R.E.S Act as a funding source there. So Pennsylvania will be publishing our amendments in the Pennsylvania Bulletin next week, Saturday. So that means our citizen comment period, which is an expedited period from the C.A.R.E.S Act, will run essentially the length of the first week of May. So, so we'll have an expedited period within that time period. On April the 29th, we'll host a public hearing. That's our tool for being able to notify the public and hear public comment about how we're proposing to utilize our funds, and then be able to submit that plan to HUD and be ready to go as soon as those dollars are available and released to our communities. So again, thank you. This has been a great opportunity for us to hear what's going on nationally, and I'm happy to answer any questions that might come up.
Great, thanks Kathy, and thanks everybody. We're going to get through as many of the questions as we can. A reminder that if you have a question, type it into the Q&A box and we will try to answer them. There's one question for you, Mike, that it looks like you answered already, but I want to actually ask it because I think it's really important. So if you don't mind repeating your answer. And the question is that local governments are being told by their regional HUD office that the emergency CDBG allocation cannot be used for rental assistance. How do we advocate to make sure this is clarified, corrected? And it looks like in your answer, you directed people to the actual guidance.
Phyllis, it looks like we lost Mike. He may have needed to jump off, so we don't actually have Mike at the moment.
Oh, okay. Well,
I can answer
oh, great.
that.
Great, Ed.
So it's in the entitlement cities regulations. It's actually in the ineligible activities section. It's paragraph 4, and it says that normally you can't use CDBG money for things like income payments and whatnot. But then at the last clause, except for paying to service providers up to 3 months worth of rental assistance, mortgage assistance, or utility assistance for the households that need it. And I reached out to my kind of long-term contact over there, a career staff person, and that person concurred. And if you go to basically CDBG, the guidebook that is on HUD's website, you'll see that spelled out a number of times as well. And I will also add that we've heard from some of our statewide housing partners like the Housing Alliance, but not from Housing Alliance on this particular issue, that their state officials were saying, well, for the state program, you cannot do that. And that's understandable because the state regulations are different, as Kathy knows, and it doesn't provide that kind of option. But if you go to another guidebook called basically CDBG for states, there are a number of places, like 5 or 6 places in that says, yeah, if a state wants to, it can use the entitlement jurisdiction regulations as a safe harbor, and therefore could use CDBG for rental assistance, mortgage assistance, or utility payments. And I'm told by a reliable source that one of the HUD guidances that will be coming out will clarify that.
Okay, great. And there are a few questions regarding whether or not the information we're providing is written down or will be written down. We'll be providing the information that we presented today as long as it's available as soon as possible, including the question that Ed just answered. Our next question.
Phyllis,
yeah.
What I know, I kind of had to run through my presentation within a fairly fast clip in order to not put people to sleep. Everything I said was written in various memo members articles, but I know those are hard to find. Even I have trouble kind of, when did I write that? If you would like, I could convert what I wrote into some kind of document, share it with you, but I probably can't get it to you until Monday.
That would be fine. We really appreciate that.
Okay.
That's great. There are 2 questions that are about the requirements for eligibility of households, specifically for CDBG. There's one, so I'm going to ask these 2 questions together. So there's one question that says, we've heard that 70% of CDBG has to serve low-income residents. What about residents who do not meet that eligibility criteria but have since experienced loss of or reduced incomes? And then the second question is that is whether or not it's possible to use CDBG funding for households at 200 to 400% of the federal poverty level. Can someone answer those questions?
Well, this is Ed again. I don't want to monopolize, but a number of people have asked me that first question, and I got, by going through the regulations and other resources, I got sort of an ambiguous, I couldn't quite tell, and I was asked to submit that question to the CPD, inbox, as it were, and I have not heard back. So I'm guessing that too will be answered in subsequent guidance.
Okay, great.
And what was the second question? Go ahead.
The next question is related to waivers. And the question says, HUD waivers related to the home program permit temporary self-certification of income eligibility with follow-up income verification within 90 days after the waiver. Will similar waivers be forthcoming for CDBG? Ed, do you know the answer to that question?
I don't have that kind of wisdom, and my contacts there are not that good. It's it's all a wait and see game. I don't know, Kathy, you might have heard more, or Mike, you might be closer.
At this point, we are in a waiting game for any CDBG waiver guidance. We understand that it is forthcoming, but we don't have the specifics on timing just yet.
Yeah. I just remembered the second part of the first question, or the two-parter. Can people above 70% be assisted, or technically I think the secretary has that waiver authority. We don't know. They often do that with CDBG disaster recovery money, and that's something that we disagree with, but that's a possibility. We hope not. And I guess about the 200% of poverty level, I think that would depend on where does that fit within the 80% AMI and whether or not the 80% AMI is waived.
Okay. The next question is with regard to assisting immigrants. Ed, you had excuse me, you had talked about this, and the question is, will accessing assistance for immigrants affect their immigration status?
No, that's what I was meaning about the public charge implications. And the experts, I'm no expert on this, but the experts say that it would not affect their immigration status or get them kind of caught up in the new draconian public charge rule. And in part, I think it's because these are all kind of temporary things.
Right. Okay, thanks. Kathy, this next question is for you. Do you know if Act 179 will apply to the remaining 3/5 of the CDBG money that has not yet been awarded?
At this point, we do not believe so, because it is not, if they're not governed by the HCDA and distributed by the federal fiscal year or federal traditional allocation requirements. So at this point, we don't believe so, but we need to see ensure how they're being distributed. But assuming that they're coming by a newly created formula, then they would not be.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is with regard to whether or not CARE funds can be used to remediate properties in disrepair.
If Mike or Kathy don't want to jump in, I'll take a shot at this. I mean, you can use regular CDBG money to do that. I think, and as I said before, the first $2 billion tranche, as I read the statute, I don't think it requires that money to be used to address the pandemic-related issues. I'm anxious just to see what the HUD guidance says about that first $2 billion. But I would hope that the $2 billion would be required to be used in ways that would address pandemic and not remediating, situations in housing conditions. And I'm pretty sure that the $1 billion and the remaining $2 billion, those will have to be used to address the pandemic.
Yeah, our read on that is is a little bit different in that our read is that those funds do have to address, to prepare for, prevent, or respond to the coronavirus. So, so at this point, I think I'd have to agree with you, Ed, is that your typical CDBG, your traditional CDBG funds, which again are going to be likely a greater allocation than this initial CARES Act allocation, would probably be the best just suited for rehabilitation of vacant or blighted properties.
Great. The next question, Kathy, is for you. What are the expected priority allocations for ESG for the state share?
Sure. So ESG is, we're allowing applicants to apply for any of the eligible areas. We anticipate that the majority of those funds would be used for either shelter or homeless prevention. Now, in our program, we do allow direct federal entitlements to apply to the ESG. They do not receive priority over the balance of state communities and are only eligible to apply under the homelessness prevention or rapid rehousing program components. So that is, and it's new that we're allowing homelessness prevention for our entitlement communities as well. But we have not set, unlike our traditional ESG allocations, where we usually set minimums for rapid rehousing or establish maximums for emergency shelter and shelter operations. We have not done this here, and we're allowing our communities to establish their local needs based on their data and the circumstances that are impacting their families and their communities.
Great. The next question is also with regard to ESG funding. And the question is, can ESG funding programmed for shelter be reallocated to cover motels or hotels to depopulate shelters. And Jerry, that's a question for you, but then Kathy, you should probably pipe in if you have the answer to that as well.
So briefly, the answer is yes, although most cities, I'm based in California for the National Alliance, so FEMA money can be used for hotels as well. And I think jurisdictions should weigh whether or not, that's a better strategy to tap into FEMA dollars if you don't think your ESG dollars are going to stretch as far. But Kathy probably also has some insights in terms of what's happening in Pennsylvania.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, we actually have reached out to HUD through the Ask a Question on this very question because several of our shelters have looked to minimize their overall census in order to address appropriate social distancing requirements. And traditionally, an ESG for street outreach and homeless prevention may not be used for hotel or motel. However, hotel, and I'm actually reading right off of the Ask a Question response, so apologize for looking over to my screen, but the cost of hotel motel voucher is only eligible under the ESG component and would be an eligible cost under shelter operations if no appropriate shelter is available. And in this case, if we're looking where there's no other safe location or if they need to limit their census as a result of social distancing needs. So that would be considered that there is no other alternative available, and therefore they'd be allowed to utilize their ESG for those resources or for those particular hotel or motel stays.
Great. The next question is about coordination of resources where more than one resource can be used for the same activity. Are any of you aware of any guidance on how, as an example, CDBG rental assistance should be coordinated with ESG rental assistance? And if you're not aware of any guidance, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how that could be and should be coordinated at the local or state level.
I don't want to jump in on this one if someone else has another nugget for it, but I will note that. Go ahead, Ed.
Again, I don't want to be stepping on your toes all the time, Kathy. But I kind of in talking to my my career staff person about the use of CDBG for rental assistance, the little coda at the end of the very brief email was, and this is unofficial. This is a personal response. Is that yes, you can use it for rental assistance, but be careful about double dipping with ESG or some other funds, maybe FEMA funds. And so it's going to take real coordination between the entities that are allocating the CDBG, the ESG, the FEMA, and whatever money, so that there is not that kind of double dip. For example, if you get CDBG money and you use it for March, April, and May, you want to make sure that the ESG money is not also used for March, April, and May, but is used for June, July, and August, and September, and October, and November. That's sort of my gut sense. And people keep asking, where's the guidance? I'm turning blue in the face waiting for the guidance. Go ahead, Kathy.
No, I think you're spot on there. And I think the one thing that I would add as well, especially in looking at the use of CDBG for rental assistance, is make sure you're communicating with your field office, with your HUD field office, or if you're a DCD grantee with DCD, and treating it as a public service. One of the components that's in the federal regulation is that moderate income households cannot benefit at the expense of the low or very low income. And you want to be mindful that that we're targeting and utilizing our resources to assist those in need in our communities. The other thing I would be mindful of is the CDBG C.A.R.E.S specifically calls out the Stafford Act requirements and being exceptionally mindful of duplication of benefits. That's something that I'm hopeful that HUD is going to provide a little bit more guidance on, duplication of benefits as it relates to a disaster declaration in a natural disaster, in some cases looks different because we're talking about direct FEMA assistance for shelters, or we're talking about different types of assistance that are coming in, but they're in more refined and finite buckets. I heard a HUD official just yesterday call it the waterfall of assistance that's coming through, and I think that's in part of the reason why we are experiencing maybe a slowing of getting some of this guidance out on waivers for CDBG, is that there's so many potential issues that we might have to address, especially when it comes down to duplication of benefits. So make sure that your record indicates, make sure that your file indicates that you're not showing or providing benefit to someone who's receiving benefit from another entity, whether it's SBA or, be very cautious about supplanting other resources, utilize your local resources where you can as well. So, just a word of caution there, and we're keeping an eye on that one as well.
Great. We are at the end of our time for this webinar today. If we did not answer your question, we will be sending out the answers to the questions that we answered and didn't answer shortly. As I already said, we will be continuing to send out information about more guidance as it becomes available. I want to say thank you to each person who spent their time with us today, especially to our speakers. This was really helpful. It's a lot of information. We appreciate that each of you is helping us here at the Housing Alliance and our network to digest that information. For those of you that were participated in this webinar, please let us know at the Housing Alliance how we can continue to help you. More soon, of course, and everybody stay safe, stay well, and thank you for all you do. Thank you.